Administrative law refers to the regulations and rulings of federal, state, and local administrative agencies. Okay? They deal with what permits you need to build your house, and the standards for food and drug quality, and even how your school system is structured. All of these things are governed by administrative agencies. For example, when Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA, it also authorized an administrative agency called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It authorized the EEOC to issue regulations that would carry out the ban on employment discrimination. Now this makes sense. Congress it can't possibly create statutes for every detail of the law. There's just too much. In fact, we probably don't want Congress to do that. They have a hard enough time agreeing on the big questions. So often what Congress will do will just pass a statute that says discrimination based on disability is illegal. And then it'll delegate authority to an administrative agency like the EEOC to handle the details of how to implement the statute. Now, once an administrative agency is established, it kind of acts like its own little quasi-government. It can issue regulations to administer or enforce the statute. So it has kind of a quasi-legislative role or rule-making role. It can also issue licenses and permits. So I guess you could say that it has a quasi-executive role. And it can even hear complaints and issue decisions in disputes over its regulations and its licenses and permits, assuming that Congress set the agency up that way. So it also has a quasi-judicial role. Okay, so we'll say hear complaints. So let's say, for example, that you believe under the regulations of an agency you're entitled to unemployment benefits. Well, but you're denied these unemployment benefits. Now you can request that an administrative law judge review your case. And then if you lose that, there's usually an appeal, an appeals board of some kind. And all of this is within, it's all within the agency. Okay, so you can see how it's sort of like its own little government. You see what the rules are. If you think that the rules have been violated, you can ask an administrative law judge to review your case. If you don't like the outcome there, you can appeal to the appeals board. Now, usually if you have a dispute with your agency, you can eventually appeal your case to a state or a federal court. But to do that, you have to go through all of the steps within the administrative agency. It's called exhausting your administrative remedies. So you'll have to have the administrative law judge hear your complaint first. And then only after you've done that, and then you've appealed up to the appeals board, only then can you appeal to a state or a federal court. Let's talk about some examples of administrative agencies. You've probably heard of some of these. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Here's one you've almost certainly heard of, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Motor Vehicles. That one's usually a state agency. The Department of Motor Vehicles is a state-level agency. Now, for now, the most important thing for us is the rulemaking part. This is the most important part of administrative law for what we're doing. And the regulations that the different agencies issue are primary authorities. They are the law. They're just like statutes in that sense. But they aren't statutes. They're not voted on by Congress and signed into law by the chief executive. So you can't find them in the United States Code or in the state codes. They're published somewhere else. Federal regulations you can find in a publication called the Federal Register. Federal Register. The Federal Register is kind of like statutes at large. All the regulations from all the federal administrative agencies are published in the Federal Register, and they're published in chronological order in the Federal Register. So again, this is similar to how federal statutes are published in chronological order in statutes at large. And just to give you a sense of how many federal agencies there are and how many regulations those agencies issue, there is an edition to the Federal Register that comes out every day. Every day. But like statutes at large, the Federal Register is basically impossible to find anything in. Unless you know the specific date that something happened, you'll never find it in the Federal Register because it's all in chronological order. So just like how the statutes in statutes at large are organized or grouped, or we say codified in the United States Code, the regulations in the Federal Register are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. The Code of Federal Regulations. Let's give ourselves a little more room here to write. Okay, this is abbreviated CFR. So this is similar to how the statutes in the United States Code are codified into the United States Code. So the regulations in the Federal Register are codified in the CFR, in the Code of Federal Regulations. And then they are organized into subject groupings called titles, just like how the statutes in the United States Code are organized into subject groupings called titles. So for example, Title 11 of the Code of Federal Regulations deals with federal elections. And boy, running out of room here. Scroll down a little bit more. Title 24, to give another example, deals with housing and urban development. And one more example. Let's say Title 14. Title 14 deals with the federal aviation regulations. When you get on a plane and you hear the flight attendant say, federal aviation regulations require that you do blank, well, they're talking about the regulations that are found in Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, there are 50 titles in the CFR. They don't correspond to the titles in the United States Code. It just happens to have a similar number. Actually, the United States Code has 51 titles. State regulations are not found in the Federal Register or in the Code of Federal Regulations. They're found in different publications. Every state has its own way of making its regulations public, but the state governments usually follow a similar process of organizing and publishing their agency regulations. Now again, for our purposes, remember that regulations are the law. If you violate a regulation, you are breaking the law. So just like how a statute can be a rule in our IRAC because it's a law, well, so can a regulation. A regulation can be our rule in IRAC because it's the law. And we use statutes and regulations in similar ways in legal analysis.